The WORLDVIEW.
I went to the bank, Key Bank, to cash a check that was from Key Bank. Gave the lady 3 forms of ID: military, driver's license, and debit card. Was acting like she was running the check through the system or whatnot. She got another customer that came through the drive-through, so she went in and, waited on them, came back, cashed this check. Then she resumed working on my check. The next thing I noticed is she was, making a phone call. So she was calling to verify the check. I asked her, if there was a problem. She wasn't able to get a hold of anybody. So she basically asked me if I could go sit down and wait for somebody to call back. And I was like, well, what's the problem? I mean, I've done this before. It was a very smooth process. What's the difference today? And she said, it's something with the numbers. Okay, I would say, well, what's wrong with the numbers? It was a $300 check. Then she said the check sequences, there was something with the check sequence and that she can't match up a signature. And so she was all over the place. So I knew that she was lying, that she really just didn't trust me, for some reason. I even asked her, I said, what process do you use to discern who you're going to screen or not? Just to see what she was going to say. Because I already knew what the situation was. She wanted to verify, and so basically, all the lady on the phone, she said, yeah, this is Rondell. Give him his money, you know what I mean? So, but the point is that the lady wasn't black. She wasn't white. She was Indian, West Indian. And, I was actually wrote about it this morning, how foreigners, even buy into the racial profile and this whole racial culture. It's just a racial culture that we live in. When we all go beyond race, like me and you discuss all the time, if we see each other in France, what are we going to say to each other?
Right.
When you hear me talk, you're going to say, "Are you American?" I'm going to say, "Yeah, I'm American." Yeah, and then we're probably going to meet up later on or whatnot. You know what I'm saying? Because we found our common ground that we're both citizens of the United States.
It's interesting though. We've had these conversations before, and I've left them, and they've caused me to think a lot, and I always love that. And I've talked about this with my brother too, who has a segment on the show with me. And there's a lot of things about my ideology and my worldview that I feel very, very confident about. Some of them are because of my faith. Some of them are just values that I hold very firmly and dear. The one aspect of my cultural perspective, though, that I'm constantly reassessing and relooking at is the aspect of race. Am I looking at this because of my race? Am I looking at this like this because of my background? So on. So I'm trying to have that be a little bit less firm because I think there's just so much wrapped into that. The last time we talked about stuff like this, I left and I thought about it, and I thought, the thing about having these conversations with you that I find to be really interesting, and maybe you will too, I hear you say these things, and then I look around at the world, and I obviously know they're true. And I even think the interesting thing about this conversation is that as you're hearing this conversation, and if you're a white guy, you're just waiting for the other foot to drop, and you're thinking, oh no, here it is. She's going to be some older woman. one of those flags. What are those flags that the black guy doesn't like? Yeah. I'm just waiting for you to tell me that she has one of these like tattoos or whatever. And then the interesting thing about your conversation is you're like, no, she's like West Indian or whatever you said. So that's the other foot kind of dropped there.
I can walk into an establishment and tell I'm not welcome there instantly. Like you can feel the vibe. I'm saying you walk into a bar, you feel like I'm not. I don't feel like I belong in this.
Absolutely. I mean, I felt that way too. There is where people disagree. It's not. Hey, is there a racial problem, or hey, is this a problem? The problem is, first of all, what's the cause? People disagree on that. And second of all, is this even something that we as a people, now I'm not talking about individuals like you or me, because that's already an inevitable yes, but do we as a people, and then as a result of that, as a power structure, and then more importantly as a government, do we even want to solve these problems? I've come to the conclusion that no, the answer is to solve these problems.
I've come to that conclusion too.
You have?
Absolutely not. We don't want to solve those problems.
But I think the people want to solve the problem way, way more than the infrastructure wants to solve it.
Not some people. You're going to find people on both sides of the fence that are completely sold into the division point of view. Then you're going to have people on the, like us, who think that's ignorant. I've talked to it on all sides of the fence. People who believe that Colorado should be given to black people or something. In America likes things to be divided and calculated so that, if you have this amount of African Americans, you can
then you check the box or what.
You got demographics and culture, and you can sell to this group in a certain way, so I think it's part of society.
If it were just the American people, like if what we were dealing with was just people getting along, people seeing beyond their cultural comfortability and all these things that we've discussed ad nauseum. If we were talking about just that, I would actually be really, really, really hopeful and encouraged, because obviously there's problems, and just like you said, there are some people that don't want to. But I don't think that's our greatest problem anymore. I think, and I really believe this, Rondell, and push back if you disagree, the problem is not the people of our country. The problem is the power structure and the politics. Because I think that race in this country will never, ever, ever be allowed to heal or to move beyond a certain point. That's behind us, kind of thing. Because it's way too powerful. It's way too powerful.
It's getting worse. It's
getting worse. Right, it's getting worse.
I was thinking the other day, and I'll say this, that I believe the next civil war in America is going to be a religious battle.
I think you're right.
It's going to be Muslims versus Christians, which is another form of racism. The majority of the United States are tolerant people that wants to coexist. The majority of us.
Yeah, I agree.
But there is a minority, which is a large group of people who don't see it that way. There's a billboard off of Westerville and Ennis Road, right? It's promoting the Quran and Muslims and Islam, right? It says, "Have you tried Islam?" or something like that. Don't quote that exactly. I'm going to take a picture of it. And it says 1 billion people, 1 billion believers, 100 million people have memorized the Quran. It was something else. But all I remember, it was like, wow, that was a billion people. They're really making a statement,
Right.
And when I seen it, it's huge. I was like, the mass mainstream recruiting is now begun. So over time, in a generation and 2 generations, when recruiting and the population that's migrating over here, because we know Somalia is here in Columbus, a lot of Muslims.
Sure.
These kids are growing up in our school systems, and
right, absolutely,
they're going to multiply even more. So as that culture becomes more dominant and more prominent in this country, things is going to have to change. Things will change. Leadership will become more, we're going to have our first Muslim mayors and our, whatever. The point is that these people will start navigating through the leadership, making decisions.
I agree.
Determine the laws. And then some people go with the flow of change, but a lot of people resist change.
That's a very interesting conversation you're kicking open here, because what you're describing, at least if the rest of the globe is any indicator. Now
which
we have which it definitely is. That's not like, hey, look who's coming to dinner type change. What we're talking about, fundamental ideological differences that cannot be rectified in a traditional democracy process. It's very true what you're saying. And Western Europe and certainly Central Europe now is a canary in the coal mine with that. What you're describing right now, they're dealing with right now. They got little pockets of Sharia law and they've done it through their own system, through democracy. They've put people in office.
If you go to community meetings they have their representatives there, you know, that's representing their constituency, just like the Latino people. You know, they don't pay interest, so laws will be changed to be able to accommodate that. You know, if you go to a lot of public schools, the kids don't get pork anymore in school. When we was coming up, you know, I didn't eat pork, but you know, that was what's on the menu. You know what I mean? You know, certain changes we're going to see occur as a result of having more of a Islamic community in America.
The Islamic culture, it has not proven to do very well with non-Islamic neighbors. One of the things that America has thrived at is if you want to carve out, you know, Little China, or if you want to carve out whatever it is, that's actually really cool for America, because then we can go down there and experience this and experience the food and whatever. But you can't want to, like, kill everybody who's not Little China. You know what I mean? You can't do that. And so that's the problem that the Islamic culture has been having, at least in Europe. Not only do they want these things in their communities, but they don't want anybody disobeying these things.
Yeah,
it's called theocracy.
Well, apparently you're more political than we thought.
Follow the Atheist Antidote on Twitter, Facebook, and YouTube.